The man in seat 34C looked like he'd slept in his clothes. And that was exactly the point. Daniel Mercer was 56 years old, and he owned the airplane. He owned all of them, 240 aircraft with his airline's name on the tail, 40,000 employees, a fortune built one route at a time over 30 years. That night he wore a faded fleece and a ball cap pulled low, and he carried a boarding pass in a name that wasn't quite his, and he folded his big frame into a middle seat in the last block of coach on a red-eye across the country. Because numbers on a report had started to worry him, and he had learned long ago that you cannot read a company from the front of the plane, he had come to test his crew. He expected to be disappointed in a small, ordinary way. Instead, before the night was over, a flight attendant nobody had ever promoted would do something that made a billionaire put his hand over his mouth in the dark of a quiet cabin. This is what she did. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The cabin smelled of recycled air and coffee that had been sitting too long, and Daniel noticed the coffee, because his mother used to come home smelling of it after 16-hour days. Marion Mercer had been a flight attendant for 32 years, back when the job meant a girdle check and a smile you weren't allowed to drop, and a paycheck that didn't match the hours. She'd raised Daniel on layover stories, and the stories were never about the famous people in first class. They were about the last row. You want to know what an airline is really worth, she'd tell him. Don't look at the front of the plane. Look at how they treat the people in the back who can't do a thing for them. When Daniel built Vantage Air out of 2 leased planes and a stubborn idea, he built it on that sentence. He'd put it on the wall of every crew room, and lately he'd begun to fear the words had become like most words on walls, read by no one, lived by fewer. So on the anniversary of his mother's death, he bought a cheap seat under a half-false name and went to the back of the plane to see what his airline had become when it thought no one important was watching. He settled into 34C between a sleeping student and the window, and he waited and he watched. He didn't have to wait long. 3 rows up, on the aisle, sat an old man who was clearly out of his depth in the air. He was 79, thin inside a jacket a size too big, his hands not quite steady, a worn leather folder clutched in his lap like it might fly away. His name was Earl Whitaker, though Daniel wouldn't learn that for another hour. Earl was cold. The cabin had gone chilly the way they do at altitude, and he flagged down the senior flight attendant working the aisle and asked, in a soft voice, if he might trouble her for a blanket. The purser's name was Gail Thorne, and she had been flying for 26 years, and somewhere in those years, something in her had gone hard and stayed hard. "Blankets are $4, she said, not unkindly at first, just flat. Card only. We don't take cash." Earl fumbled out a worn debit card with a hand that shook, and Gail ran it on her device, and it declined. She ran it again, declined, and here her voice changed, took on the thin edge of a person who has decided someone is a problem rather than a person. "It's not going through, sir. I can't just hand out blankets. There are procedures." She said it loud enough that the rows around him went quiet, loud enough that Earl's ears went red. And the old man pulled his too big jacket tighter around himself and whispered that it was all right, that he didn't need it, that he was sorry to be a bother. He folded his shaking hands back over the leather folder and looked out at the dark. Daniel watched from 34C and felt something cold open up in his chest. This was the thing he'd feared, wearing a uniform with his name on the wingpin. He almost stood up. He almost said the 4 words that would have ended it. He didn't. He didn't move fast. That was the discipline of 30 years. You don't fix the line by jumping into it. You watch long enough to see who the people on it really are. So he stayed in his seat, and he kept watching, and that was how he saw the other one. She came from the back galley, where she'd been working alone. Her name was Loretta Pryor, 55 years old, 29 of them in the air, and she had the kind of face that had told 10,000 strangers that everything was going to be fine, and meant it every time. She had seen the whole thing from the back. She came up the aisle, and she crouched down in it beside Earl's seat, all the way down so she was looking up at him instead of down, and she put her hand on the armrest near his. "Now," she said, gently, "what's got you all the way back here looking so worried, my friend?" And Earl, who had been holding it together with both shaking hands, told her. His wife was named Dot. They had been married 54 years. She was in a hospital 2 time zones away, and she was dying. And the doctors had said it could be hours and it could be a day. Nobody could say, and his daughter had put him on the cheapest seat she could find at midnight because it was the only one left, and he was terrified. Not of flying, he said, but of the math of it, the hours against the hours. The fear that he would come all this way and arrive to a room where she had already gone. He'd had nothing to eat since morning because the meals were a charge too, and he was diabetic, and his hands were shaking for more reasons than the cold. Loretta listened to all of it, the whole way through. The way you listen when the listening is the only thing you have to give yet. Then she stood up, and she went and got a blanket and tucked it around him herself. And when Earl reached again for the card that wouldn't work, she put her hand over his and said, "That's on me, and I won't hear another word about it." She brought him her own crew meal, the one she'd been saving for her break, and a juice for his sugar, and she sat on the arm of the empty seat beside him while he ate, and she told him about the time the airline got her to her own mother's bedside with 20 minutes to spare, and that 20 minutes was a whole lifetime if you used it right, and that they were going to get him his minutes. Earl ate, and some of the shaking went out of his hands, and a few of the people in the nearby rows who had watched him be humiliated now watched him be cared for, and the cabin felt, for a little while, like a better place than it had 10 minutes before. Gail Thorne did not see it that way. She pulled Loretta into the galley, and Daniel, 2 rows back with his eyes closed like a sleeping man, heard most of it. "You're behind on the cart, you gave away your meal, and you're comping blankets on your own card," Gail said, low and clipped. "You can't fix every sad story that gets on this airplane, Loretta. I've watched you try for years. It's why you're still in the back of the plane at 55 and I'm running the cabin. Do the job that's in the manual and stop performing." "He's somebody's whole world, Gail," Loretta said. Quiet, not angry. "That's in the manual too. It's just on a page nobody reads anymore." Loretta Pryor had been passed over for purser 4 times. She knew the reason, and the reason was standing in front of her. She'd spent 29 years choosing the page nobody read, and it had cost her the promotions and the seniority and the better schedule. And it had never once cost her a single night's sleep over whether she'd done right, which was a trade she'd have made again. She had her own mother in a care home now that ate every spare dollar, and she flew doubles to cover it, and she was tired in a way that went to the bone. None of that had changed the math she lived by, which was the opposite of the math that was scaring Earl. She had decided a long time ago that you spend what you have on the person in front of you, and you let the ledger sort itself out later. The ledger was about to get harder. 90 minutes from the connection city, the captain came on with the news every red-eye dreads. Weather ahead, a hold, then a diversion in the pattern. They would land late. Loretta did the connection math in her head before the seatbelt sign finished chiming, and she went cold. Earl's connecting flight, the last one of the night to the city where Dot was dying, would be long gone by the time their wheels touched down. The next one was 11 hours out. 11 hours that Dot Whitaker might not have. She knelt by Earl again and told him the truth, because he was a grown man and deserved it, and she watched a 79-year-old's face come apart quietly, which is the worst kind of coming apart, the kind that doesn't make any noise. He didn't rage. He just looked at the leather folder in his lap. 54 years of a marriage, Daniel would later learn, was inside it. Photographs and a wedding program gone soft at the folds, and he said, mostly to himself, I told her I'd be there. I promised her I'd be there. Daniel Mercer, in 34C, put his hand over his mouth in the dark, and Loretta Pryor made her decision the way she'd made every decision that had kept her in the back of the plane for 29 years. She got on the galley phone during the descent and started working it, operations, the other carriers' desks, anyone who'd pick up. When they landed, an hour and 40 minutes late into a terminal going quiet for the night, she did not clock out and go to the crew hotel where her exhausted body was owed a bed. She took Earl by the arm and walked him through the empty concourse herself, his folder clutched to his chest, and she found what she'd already feared she'd find, nothing on Vantage until morning. So she went to the one place left. A competitor had a final flight to Dot City, boarding in 40 minutes, 2 seats open at a walk-up fare that cost more than Loretta made in a week. She bought it on her own card, her actual card, the one with her mother's care home draining it dry. For 1 second, she would admit this later. Because she was an honest woman, she did the other math. The selfish-sounding math that isn't really selfish at all. That fare was a week of her own mother's room. It was the cushion she didn't have, the margin between getting by and not. She stood at that counter with a card in her hand and thought of her mother by the window 2,000 miles away, and she thought of Dot Whitaker, and of a promise an old man had made that he could not keep alone. And then she did the thing she had always done, which was the reason she was 55 and still in the back of the plane, and the reason she could sleep at night, every night, the whole night through. She slid the card across the counter. She didn't pause over it longer than it takes to do the right thing, which is no time at all once you've decided who you are. Then, because Earl was shaking again and couldn't manage the gate change alone and there was a second seat, she did the thing that made the gate agent stop and stare and a small crowd of stranded travelers go quiet. She boarded the other airline's flight beside him, on her own dime, on her own time, off the clock and out of uniform, to fly 2 time zones in the wrong direction and personally walk a frightened old man to his dying wife's bedside, with no plan for how she'd get herself back and no expectation that anyone would ever know she'd done it. She had no idea that the tired man in the ball cap from 34C had followed them off the plane and was standing 20 feet away, watching, with his hand still over his mouth. He didn't move fast even then. He waited until she'd gotten Earl settled into the jet bridge line and stepped back to catch her breath. And then Daniel Mercer walked over, and he took off the ball cap. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to do something for me." Loretta turned, braced for one more obstacle at the end of a long night. "Sir, I'm sorry, I'm about to board. You're not going to need that ticket," he said gently. "Either of them." He held out his hand. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I own the airline you've worked for 29 years. I was in 34C. I've been watching since the blanket." He had to stop a moment. "My mother flew for 32 years, and she used to tell me to judge the whole company by how it treated the last row. I came on tonight afraid of what I'd find back there. And then I found you. What happened next happened fast, because Daniel Mercer, when he finally moved like a man who owned 240 airplanes. There was a Vantage jet on the ground at that field, repositioning empty for a morning route. By the time Loretta had finished trying to refuse the refund he was pressing on her, that jet had a new flight plan and a crew called in, and Earl Whitaker was being walked, not to a crowded gate, but down a quiet jet bridge to a plane with 16 seats and his name the only one on the manifest, with a company car and a hospital escort waiting on the other end. Earl kept trying to thank him and couldn't find the words, and Daniel just held the old man's shaking hands in both of his and said, "Go be with her. We've got the rest." Earl went. Then Daniel turned to the two flight attendants standing in the emptying terminal, the one who'd given everything and the one who'd watched him decide what kind of company she worked for. He was not cruel about it, because his mother had taught him that cruelty is just another way of being lazy. He told Gail Thorne the truth, quietly, which was worse than shouting. He told her that what he'd watched her do to a frightened old man was a line, and that she would not run another of his cabins, and that he understood. He did. That she'd learned her coldness in an airline that had spent years rewarding the manual over the human being, and that the fault for that was partly his, and that he intended to fix the thing that had made her. She would be grounded, retrained, and given a chance to remember why she'd taken the job at 24. That was more mercy than she'd shown Earl, and they both knew it. And then he turned to Loretta Pryor, and his voice changed. The silence in that terminal lasted a long moment. Loretta counted it without meaning to. "You bought a stranger a seat with money you don't have, to fly the wrong direction on your only night off," Daniel said, after the woman running your cabin told you, to your face, that it was the very reason you'd never be promoted. You did it anyway. You did it thinking no one would ever know. He shook his head slowly. 29 years. 4 times passed over. And the airline missed you because it was looking at the front of the plane the whole time, exactly like my mother said it would. His voice was not quite steady. "So here is what's going to happen," he told her. The competitor's fare, refunded 10 times over before she got home. Her mother's care home, paid in full, for as long as her mother lived, in his mother's name. And a new job, the one he'd flown coach that night, already half knowing he needed to create, though he hadn't known its name until he watched her crouch down in an aisle. Vantage Air was going to have a head of in flight culture, a person who answered to no manual but the one on the crew room wall, whose entire job was to teach 40,000 people to treat the last row the way Loretta Pryor had treated it for 29 years, without anyone above her ever once noticing. He could not think of another living soul qualified to hold it. Loretta Pryor, who had not cried over a single one of the promotions she'd lost, put her hand over her face in the middle of an empty airport and wept. It did not happen all at once, but it happened. Earl Whitaker reached Dot's bedside at 4:50 in the morning, while it was still dark, and he held her hand for 19 hours before she went, and Dot, who the doctors had said might not last the night, had somehow lasted, the way people sometimes do when there is still a hand on the way that they are waiting to hold. She woke twice in those 19 hours, and both times he was there. And the second time she squeezed his fingers and said his name. And for a man who had spent a whole terrified night doing the math of hours against hours, that was the entire fortune, the only one that had ever mattered to him. Earl wrote Loretta a letter afterward, in a shaking hand. He told her she hadn't just bought him a seat. She'd bought him the last words of a 54-year marriage, and there was no card in the world that could be declined for that. She kept the letter in the leather folder he insisted she take, and she read it on the bad days, and there were fewer bad days after that than there had been before. Gail Thorne went back to the bottom, and, to the surprise of nearly everyone, did the work. Some people, given the truth instead of a humiliation, find the thing in themselves that the job had buried, and she was one of the ones who did. The sentence on the crew room wall stopped being decoration. Loretta Pryor spent the last decade of her career making 40,000 people read the page nobody read, and the complaint numbers that had worried a billionaire into a middle seat turned slowly into a different kind of number. Her mother spent her final years in a good room with a window, and never once knew it had been a stranger in a ball cap who paid for the light coming through it. On the anniversary of his mother's death the following year, Daniel Mercer bought a cheap seat under a name that wasn't quite his and folded himself into the back of a red eye, the way he meant to do every year for the rest of his life. He watched the last rows the whole flight. And somewhere over the dark middle of the country, he saw a young attendant he didn't recognize crouch all the way down in the aisle beside a frightened passenger, down low, so she was looking up instead of down, and he heard her say, "Now, what's got you looking so worried, my friend?" The exact words, passed down a line he'd started without meaning to, and Daniel Mercer pulled his ball cap lower and closed his eyes and let his mother's airline carry him home. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.